Going right now to Washington, D.C., man of the hour, Congressman, 1st District Republican Rob Wittman. Happy Father's Day, Congressman Dr. Wittman. Good to have you with us.
John, it's great to be with you this morning. Thank you.
Took President Obama 15 hours to say, look, the problem we have, Charleston, we need stricter gun control measures. I got to say, I just thought that was way out of line, way out of place, too early. What say you?
John, I agree. Our focus right now needs to be on supporting these families that have suffered through this tragedy to make sure that we as a nation are behind the folks in South Carolina, helping them and coming to grips with this, understanding that this is a time to grieve, but it's also a time to show support. Talking about the issues in the political realm, I think, is not the time for us to do that right now. Now, certainly this will precipitate the discussion about, how do we stop these senseless acts of violence. But remember, this is about human behavior. This is about people that suffer from a variety of different forms of mental illness or get inculcated in these extremist viewpoints that cause them to act this way, cause them to act in these violent ways. So, I think that's really where the focus ought to be. And it's not, I think, the right time for us to have that discussion now. Necessarily, out of this will be the discussion about, how do we address these issues where people act out violently like this, and what causes them to either exhibit these different elements of mental illness, or in this particular circumstances, we learn more about this individual, what caused them to act in this particular way. So, that will be part of the discussion, but, to politicize it from the very beginning as we are grieving with the families in South Carolina that are going through these terrible tragedies, I don't think it's the right time for this.
Congressman, I think you're absolutely spot on, as always. Let's get to trade. You voted once again in opposition to this fast-track trade disaster. We know the reasons why. We want to compliment you on your judgment. I think you're 100% on the right side of history with this issue. But it's very convoluted. We're trying to figure out how the sausage is now being remade. What is Mitch McConnell trying to do, and how does it become law? How does it be stopped? Just try to help us
John,
understand.
from what I understand, yesterday the House voted separately on the Trade Promotion Authority bill. So that, as I understand, will go back to the Senate. It actually came to us as a bill to concur with a Senate amendment. So by the convoluted process, they add this to a bill as an amendment from the Senate. They send it back so that it can be voted on there by itself. The Senate, from what I understand, on the Trade Adjustment Authority, which is the dollars that go to, help support displaced workers, which always amazes me that we say somehow Trade Promotion Authority is good, but then we're going to pay for displaced workers here in the United States, and somehow this is going to add jobs. And I understand the numbers in talking about what it adds as far as economic opportunities, but it does create imbalances there as this comes about, if it indeed does eventually come about. But then the Senate then has to act on the Trade Adjustment Authority, and there's folks over there that are not in favor of Trade Promotion Authority without Trade Adjustment Authority. So it's my understanding they'll vote separately on the Trade Promotion Authority. They'll act by sending their bill that has already passed Trade Adjustment Authority and send that back to the House. So that, I believe, will be before us next week on another Senate vehicle or as an amendment to a House bill with that on there. So it's a very convoluted process as to how this trading back and forth goes to bring these bills back up again. But that's the mechanism that Trade Promotion Authority came to us yesterday as a Senate amendment. And it's my understanding that next week Trade Adjustment Authority will come back in the same fashion.
Are you going to be able to stop it, Congressman Wittman?
I don't know, John. I think it's going to be difficult in the Senate for them to pass Trade Promotion Authority by itself because a lot of senators voted in favor of Trade Promotion Authority with the Trade Adjustment Authority. So, it's passed the House. So that part of the process is done. But I do think it's a more difficult path to navigate in the Senate by doing these things separately. That's why the House didn't do them separately to begin with, is because the Senate passed them together. So I still think it's a difficult path for Trade Promotion Authority to go through. Now, I don't know what will happen in the Senate, what arm twisting will go on there, but I know there are a lot of senators there that are reticent in voting for a Trade Promotion Authority without having the Trade Adjustment Authority going on with it.
Congressman Wittman, I just want to commend you for your courageous effort in standing up to leadership on this. This isn't an easy thing to do, and I know there's been a lot of pressure to bear, and I think you're on the right side of the history with this. Let's go to defense funding. We had your colleague, Senator Tim Kaine, on our show yesterday, and he was just becoming unglued over the fact that you're about to pass this major defense bill with things like how you deal with rust in tanks and what type of equipment is, how it's lubed, and we still don't have an authorization of war. How do you see this whole thing playing out now?
Well, both houses, or both the House and the Senate, have now passed the National Defense Authorization Act, which is indeed the blueprint for what our military will do in the coming year. Now, I think the most important next step is to pass the appropriations bill and actually fund that. The House has done its job, but as you know, the Senate yesterday voted not to do that. They struck down the effort to bring the defense appropriations bill to the floor. So I think that in and of itself is very problematic, to hold hostage military spending and the necessary resources for men and women in the military, hold it hostage to a Senate that wants to promote more spending in other domestic programs. And they say, well, you can't spend more in defense without spending more in other areas of discretionary spending. And I would adamantly disagree with that we have an obligation to fund this nation's military, a constitutional responsibility to do that. There is no such constitutional responsibility to spend more in the other domestic areas. And you saw the Congressional Budget Office report that came out last week talking about the problems that this nation will face in the not-too-distant future with its deficit and debt. So I think we have to make sure we stay on track with that. So I think that's an issue. Talking about the authorization of use of military force, the War Powers Act in relation to what's happening now in Syria and Iraq, I do believe that Congress needs to have the debate and needs to direct the executive branch as to what it should or should not do in the efforts of pursuing the conflict there in the Middle East against ISIS. I do believe that the AUMF that the President sent over, or the authorization for the use of military force concept the President sent over, is not one that I would be in favor of, because it is non-specific in many areas, and in some areas I believe doesn't go far enough to give our military leaders the tools they need to actually be successful there. So I do believe that debate needs to happen, that both the House and the Senate need to bring that up, because we are well past the time frame that the President has to act under the War Powers Act by himself without congressional concurrence. So I do believe that needs to be part of it. But as part of the debate about defense, the most important element that we can do right now is to make sure that we are clear on the funding and make sure that we are funding our military for what they are doing right now. We do need to have the debate, though, on the authorization of use of military force.
So, Congressman Wittman, then you would be in favor. You think that the defense authorization bill should be separate. There shouldn't be these domestic spending riders attached to that like they did in the Senate, right?
Absolutely. I think that it's very clear what our responsibilities are in funding our nation's military. It's very clear the things that we need to accomplish. It's very clear what we need to do to support our men and women in uniform. Those issues have nothing to do with issues on domestic spending, and to tie those two together and somehow say we will not vote on anything to do with military spending until we can get concessions on spending more domestically, it's just nonsensical. It's just not the way to go about it, and this has never been the way Congress has operated. We've always been able to separate the defense spending issues and the issues of making sure we properly fund our nation's military from issues of domestic non-defense spending or the discretionary non-defense spending. So I just don't believe the two should be tied together, or that somehow you say, well, we're not going to fund our nation's military or provide for those dollars for raises that are in there for men and women in the military unless we can force additional domestic spending. It just doesn't make sense. And I think the American people feel the same way. We've gotten a number of calls from folks, John, saying, get this done. Don't hold hostage our men and women in the military to a agenda that promotes or wants to promote greater non-defense discretionary spending. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, I think you're right, and your neighbor, West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, voted in opposition of that yesterday. He put out a pretty terse statement and said that he was just dumbfounded by the fact that in order to back the men and women of the United States, that he had to vote on something that was going to increase the debt and the deficit, and that had all these domestic riders. And he said, basically, that's what's the matter right now with the government of the United States. He said, I'm going to, keep voting it down until they take all this stuff out. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. I know we're out of time. We're a little bit short on time today. I want to thank Congressman Rob Wittman for being with us today. Congressman Wittman, Republican, represents the 1st District of Virginia. You want more information, really easy, whitman.house.gov, whitman.house.gov. Rob Wittman, thanks for being with us. Happy Father's Day. Have a great weekend, sir.